Hello, my name is Dylan Holloway. This is the 4.6 final project. I'm doing my project on the evolution of horror films and the impact of cultural shifts on their development through the ages. Horror films have always been more than just a means to get a scare. They're a mirror reflecting the fears and anxieties of their time. As the Dictionary of Film Studies puts it, horror films represent disturbing and dark subject matter, designed to elicit fear, terror, disgust, and shock. But beyond the scares, these films offer a glimpse into a darker side of humanity and the cultural zeitgeist of each decade. Let's start with the 1920s. Horror films began to carve out their niche in cinema, reflecting the anxieties and social upheavals of the era. This decade, marked by the aftermath of World War I, economic instability, rapid societal changes, fostered a climate ripe for exploring themes of fear and the macabre. The rise of German Expressionism, with its distorted sets and eerie lighting, profoundly influenced horror cinema, as seen in seminal films like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. These films mirrored the unsettling uncertainty of the post-war period, capturing a sense of alienation and dread. These films would go on to inspire horror films throughout the century. The 1930s was a time of economic despair and political upheaval. Films like Dracula and Frankenstein by Universal Pictures explored the fears of the unknown and the consequences of tampering with nature. These monsters represented societal anxieties about scientific advancements and the dehumanizing effects of industrialization. Moving into the 1950s, the rise of nuclear anxieties and the Cold War cast a shadow over the genre. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a prime example, reflecting fears of the infiltration and loss of individuality in a climate of paranoia. The alien invasion serves as a metaphor for the fear of communism and the erosion of personal freedoms. Movies like The Blob are a perfect example of 1950s paranoia, encapsulating in a chilling, simple premise. The Blob's vivid red color is a deliberate and powerful symbol of the era's fear of communist infiltration. Its relentless, shapeless form mirrors how people saw communism as this unstoppable force that could spread and take over society. The 1960s brought social change and upheaval. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho broke new ground with its psychological horror and its examination of fractured identities and the darkness lurking behind everyday facades. The film's shocking twist and intense exploration of mental illness captured the era's growing interest in psychology and personal instability. Also, George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead not only introduced the modern zombie genre, but also made a powerful statement by casting a black actor, Dwayne Jones, in the lead role. This choice was revolutionary, directly addressing racial tension and challenging the norms of the time of Hollywood. The 1970s saw horror films reflecting the chaos and disillusionment of the era. The Exorcist tapped into fears of loss of control and the power of the supernatural, symbolizing the crisis of faith and the unknown. Meanwhile, Texas Chainsaw Massacre showcased the primal fear of violence and the breakdown of societal norms in a world that seemed increasingly out of control. This was also around the time where we were experimenting with space travel and going to the moon. This newfound fascination is reflected in iconic 1970s sci-fi films like Ridley Scott's Alien. The film's portrayal of deep space as a hostile, eerie environment, with its terrifying extraterrestrial xenomorph, resonated with the era's anxieties about the unknowns of space and technological advancements. The 1980s were a defining decade for horror, marked by a blend of innovation and a willingness to push boundaries. Stanley Kubrick released his masterpiece of horror, The Shining, in 1980. The film's portrayal of isolation, madness, and the supernatural in a seemingly serene setting of the Overlook Hotel mirrored growing cultural fears about the fragility of sanity. The film's exploration of psychological horror and the breakdown of family dynamics tapped into contemporary fears about mental health and societal expectations. Horror also began to blend with dark humor in the 80s. A Nightmare on Elm Street introduced Freddy Krueger, embodying fears of losing control even in our dreams. The era's emphasis on slasher films reflect a culture gripping with issues of violence and morality. often providing commentary on the era's consumerism and excess. The 1990s saw a resurgence of meta-horror with films like Scream, which played with genre conventions and explored the fears of media saturation and the impact of violence in popular culture. This self-awareness and commentary of the genre itself highlighted the growing concern with how horror media influenced real-life perceptions of danger. In 1999, The Blair Witch Project was released. This groundbreaking film used the found footage format to create an intense, immersive experience. Its innovative approach and minimalist production amplified the sense of realism and terror, giving way to films like Paranormal Activity. The film's use of home video technology intensifies its scares, reflecting a growing sense of anxiety in the culture, especially at a time when home video and surveillance cameras were becoming more readily available. The 2010s were also a great decade for horror. Films like Get Out addressed ongoing racial tensions and systemic issues, using horror to provide a lens into societal fractures and prejudices. Films like Hereditary emerged as a standout in modern horror. Directed by Ari Aster, the film delves into deep psychological trauma and family dynamics, using supernatural elements to explore themes of grief and inherited suffering. Its unsettling portrayal of a family's disintegration and the dark secrets they uncover reflects contemporary anxieties about mental health and the impact of unsolved trauma. As we move through the 2020s, our current culture keeps influencing horror films, just as these films continue to impact our cultural landscape. From classic monsters to modern psychological thrillers, horror films have always been a potent medium for exploring the darker aspects of humanity. They mirror our deepest fears and anxieties, serving as both reflection and a commentary on the times in which they are made. In the end, horror is more than just a genre. It's a cultural barometer that helps us understand the dark side of ourselves and the world around us. This concludes a brief look of the evolution of horror films and the impact of cultural shifts on their development through the ages.